There is a particular feeling that visits some people in the middle of an ordinary evening, surrounded by familiar faces, warm lighting, maybe the sound of a conversation they are genuinely part of, and still something in them is quietly looking for the exit. Not because anything is wrong, not because they dislike the people around them, just this faint, persistent sense that they are slightly outside the glass, watching rather than belonging, present and yet somehow not quite arrived. If you have felt that, this is for you. The thing worth naming here is not shyness, and it is not introversion, and it is not social anxiety, though it can borrow features from all three. What we are really talking about is a pattern that shows up in certain people where no environment, no relationship, no version of their life quite settles into the feeling of home. They can be comfortable, they can be happy even, but underneath there is this low humming awareness that something is slightly out of place, that they are visitors in their own life, that the sense of truly belonging somewhere has always felt about one step ahead of them, like a room they keep almost reaching. Psychologists sometimes talk about this in terms of a concept called belonging uncertainty. The sense that your place in any given group is provisional, that you have not quite been granted permanent residency the way other people seem to have been. And what is interesting about it is that it is not always tied to whether people actually like you or welcome you. Someone can be warmly received, genuinely included, and still carry that low-level doubt that they are slightly misread, that the version of them people are welcoming is not entirely the real one. So even the belonging they receive does not fully land. This tends to begin somewhere early, not always dramatically. Sometimes it is as quiet as growing up between two cultures, or two very different families, or moving around a lot as a child and learning that every place you got comfortable in eventually had to be left behind. The brain is an extraordinary pattern recognition machine, especially when you are small. And if the pattern it learned was that comfort is temporary, that connection is conditional, that home is a thing that gets interrupted, it files that away as a working theory about how the world operates. And then it keeps testing the theory, even when the world stops proving it. There is also something that attachment researchers have noticed over decades of careful work, which is that early experiences with caregivers shape what are called internal working models, essentially a mental template for how relationships feel from the inside. If the early experience was one of inconsistency, where connection was available sometimes and not others, where you had to earn warmth rather than simply receive it, the template that gets built is one where belonging always feels slightly negotiable. You are always, somewhere beneath the surface, on a kind of quiet audition. And you carry that template into adulthood without knowing you are doing it, because it does not feel like a template, it just feels like reality. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains something that can otherwise feel very confusing, which is why the feeling does not go away when circumstances improve. People who carry this pattern often do find connection. They do build lives with people who genuinely love them. They reach the milestones, they make the friendships, they find the places that suit them, and they expect that at some point the sense of not quite belonging will lift, the way a headache lifts, because the conditions that caused it are no longer there. But it does not lift, because the pattern is not being driven by the current circumstances. It is being driven by an older map. There is another layer to this that is worth understanding, and it has to do with identity. Some people who feel this way are also people who have always been somewhat hard to categorize. They move between worlds comfortably enough, but fully belong to none. They are interested in too many things, or they hold views that do not fit neatly into any one group, or they have always felt that the version of themselves they show in any one context is real but incomplete. And that can create a very specific kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being without people, but the loneliness of feeling that no single place holds all of you at once. The writer Pico Iyer has written beautifully about this as a condition of the global soul, the person who belongs everywhere and nowhere, who carries home inside rather than finding it outside. And while that framing has a certain poetry to it, the lived experience of it is often less poetic and more exhausting. Because human beings are wired for belonging. It is not a luxury. The sense of being embedded in a group, recognized, secure, was for most of human history a matter of survival. So when that sense is elusive, the nervous system registers it as a low-level threat, a background hum of unease that is hard to explain to someone who does not feel it. You are not being dramatic. The system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. What tends to play out in everyday life for people who carry this pattern looks something like this. They show up fully in relationships and then at some point quietly wonder whether the other person has noticed that they are a little stranger than they first appeared. They move to a new place and feel excited, genuinely hopeful, and then after a few months, that familiar sense of distance settles back in. They perform belonging very convincingly, often so convincingly that nobody around them suspects the internal experience, and then they come home and feel hollowed out by the effort of it. They sometimes grieve places they have left, not just with ordinary nostalgia, but with a depth that surprises them, as if the place contained a version of themselves they will never quite recover. The thing that does not help, and this is important, is waiting. Waiting for the feeling of home to arrive on its own, for the right place or the right person or the right version of your life to finally solve the equation. That waiting tends to extend indefinitely, not because it is hopeless, but because the feeling of not quite belonging in its deepest form is not something that circumstance alone can repair. It is a pattern held in the nervous system, and what changes it is different from what caused it. What tends to actually help, and this is not a fix or a cure, it is more of a shift in orientation, is moving from looking for belonging to building it. That sounds almost too simple, but there is a real difference between the two. Looking for belonging means treating it as something that exists somewhere out in the world, that you will recognize it when you find it, that one day a place or a person will produce the feeling and it will stay. Building it means understanding that belonging is partly an internal state that gets cultivated through small, repeated acts of presence. Being a little more honest with one person than feels entirely comfortable. Staying in a community longer than the point where the novelty fades. Letting yourself be known gradually rather than waiting until it feels safe, because it may never feel entirely safe. The security comes from doing it, not before. It also helps to understand that the feeling of being slightly outside the glass is not evidence that you are outside. It is evidence that you have a nervous system that learned to expect exclusion and now monitors for it constantly. That monitoring feels like perception, but it is partly prediction. And you can slowly update the prediction. One small thing, if this resonates with you. The next time you are somewhere you feel you almost belong, notice what almost means. Notice whether there is anything actually missing or whether the feeling is your own older map, refusing to confirm what is right in front of you. You do not have to argue with the feeling. Just notice it without letting it make all the decisions. And one gentle note, if this sits very heavily with you or has for a long time, please know that this kind of pattern often responds really well to working with a therapist, and what you hear here is general reflection, not a substitute for that kind of personal support. Some people spend their whole lives looking for the place they are from and slowly discover it was never a place at all. It was a quality of attention, a way of being present with people without waiting to be handed permission. Home, for some people, is not found. It is made, quietly, over time, from whatever they choose to keep returning to. That is worth holding on to. If this felt like it named something real for you, this channel puts something new out every day. A quiet subscribe means you will not miss whatever comes next, and it costs nothing. Thank you genuinely for listening.